Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to be here because it connects the dots on topics important to me, my community, and what we can do to improve our long-term preventative care. I live in Uptown and am passionate about the YWCA's mission. I originally went into nursing because I want to help people. I began studying to become a nurse practitioner because I realized I want to be on the preventative side of healthcare, which is where I think I can have a greater impact on long-term health. Loneliness and social isolation are not only timely, but also crucial to our long-term health. Although we recognize an impact on all ages, today we are focusing on older adults. The number of older adults at risk for experiencing loneliness and social isolation has increased because of the pandemic. One positive long-term effect is how COVID-19 has illuminated this public health concern that was often overlooked. Individuals are forced to sacrifice social interaction and become even more socially isolated. Now, more research is being done on how loneliness and social isolation affect our minds and bodies. It is important to understand the prevalence of social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation is not uncommon. 25% of community dwelling older adults are socially isolated, and loneliness is even more common. 43% of community dwelling older adults are lonely. Let's define social isolation and loneliness, which are not the same thing. Social isolation and loneliness overlap, but the presence of one doesn't necessarily mean you experience the other. We know that, that being socially isolated could very well cause feelings of loneliness. Social isolation refers to the objective state of having infrequent social interaction with other individuals. In other words, social isolation is factual. You do not have frequent social interaction with others. Social interaction can be voluntary or somewhat involuntary, as we have learned with COVID. Social isolation does not necessarily mean that you are lonely. Voluntary solitude, such as living alone, does not necessarily mean that you are at risk for the health implications of loneliness and social isolation. Voluntary solitude can be good. It can help us feel calm, relaxed, and help us regulate our emotions. Now that we've defined social isolation, let's look at loneliness. Loneliness is distinguishable from social isolation because loneliness is subjective. In other words, a person can feel lonely even when they live in a house with a family and are not socially isolated. Even when a person is around a bunch of other people, they can have involuntary feelings of loneliness where they perceive a lack of affection or closeness with others. It is important to understand that loneliness is involuntary and therefore distinguishable from voluntary solitude. Certain life events make us more at risk for loneliness and social isolation. Significant loss, such as a friend or family member, living alone, sensory impairments, or living with a chronic illness are risk factors. If one of these factors applies to you, you may be more at risk, but these things do not automatically mean you are lonely or socially isolated. You can live alone or have hearing loss and feel neither lonely or socially isolated. I want to talk about how loneliness and social isolation relate to depression first because I think this topic is more straightforward. Humans are social animals. We crave affection and connection with others. It makes sense that they are linked to depression. An abundance of research exists to support the claim that loneliness and social isolation negatively impact our mental health. The correlation with depression is not completely understood, but research has shown that both social isolation and loneliness are linked to depressive symptoms. People who are lonely and or are socially isolated experience higher rates of depressive symptoms. I want to point out that loneliness could and can be a symptom of depression, and if you feel lonely, you should consider the possibility that you are depressed and should seek help. With that being said, just because you feel lonely and or are socially isolated, that does not mean you are depressed. They can be separate entities. The negative effects of loneliness and social isolation on the mind is a heavy topic and not exactly uplifting, especially considering what we're all going through right now with COVID. I want to quickly point out a positive fact. Loneliness is a modifiable risk factor for cognitive health, which means it is something we can change, as opposed to a genetic predisposition, which we cannot change. Another positive is that you are all members or could be members of the YWCA, so you are already engaging in some sort of social interaction and physical activity which promotes well-being. Let's look at how loneliness and social isolation are connected to cognitive decline. There is strong and recent research to support a link between loneliness, social isolation, and cognitive decline. Loneliness and social isolation have been linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia progression. Loneliness has been linked to impaired cognitive performance. The National Academy of Sciences came out with the shocking statistic this year that there is a 50% increased risk of developing dementia associated with social isolation. There are ways of preventing this, and we'll get to that in a little bit. If you are familiar with the term use it or lose it, you can come to understand how loneliness and social isolation lead to cognitive decline. Our brain is energetically expansive, which means it expands only when needed. Our brain adjusts according to social demands. If you think about how when you exercise, you build muscle, the brain is similar. When you are social and interactive, you exercise certain parts of the brain. When we are lonely and lack social interaction, we essentially start to lose part of the brain, and long term, this is what can lead to cognitive decline. Let's look at how loneliness and social isolation impact our body, specifically our cardiovascular or heart health. Heart disease is the #1 leading cause of death in the United States among all races and both sexes. Since loneliness and social isolation are modifiable, we can work on changing these things to improve our cardiovascular health. For those unfamiliar with cardiovascular disease, I am referring to high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, and heart failure. Social isolation has been found to be associated with higher rates of hospitalization due to heart failure. It has been long understood that high blood pressure, smoking, and obesity are linked to cardiovascular disease. Recent studies have shown that social isolation and loneliness are comparable risk factors. Peripheral vascular resistance is the pressure in the circulatory system that blood must flow against. This resistance creates blood pressure. Loneliness is associated with increased peripheral vascular resistance and high blood pressure, which scientists believe is related to the chronic stress that lonely and socially isolated adults can experience. This chronic stress then leads to inflammation and places an individual at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So, what can we do to mitigate the effects on our minds and body? Here are some research interventions. Social facilitation refers to participating in an activity with the main goal of being to interact with peers or others who might be lonely. These include group-based activities, shared interest groups such as a book club, and technology-based activities such as video conferencing. Psychological therapies include mindfulness and stress reduction activities such as meditation. Animal interventions include pet ownership, becoming a pet foster parent, or perhaps volunteering at a humane society. Making new friends could include activities such as volunteering. Leisure and skill development interventions could include anything from gardening to reading or learning to play an instrument. Lastly, fitness group membership has demonstrated a decrease in loneliness and social isolation. The YWCA has free group fitness, in-person and virtual classes, on-demand classes including yoga, Pilates, cardio strength, and water fitness when the gym is open. Fee-based services include virtual and in-person personal training, small group training, nutrition coaching, and massage. The YWCA also has racial justice and public policy workshops, volunteer opportunities including the Resource Hub, Women's Triathlon, Forums on Race, indoor triathlons, and the Summer Tri-Fest.